Today's next keynote speaker is Ms. Amy Bove. She is Director Upstream with Wood Mackenzie, and she will talk about a comeback of the North Sea upstream. Please, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you all for the opportunity to be here this afternoon. It's lovely to speak with you. First, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Wood Mackenzie, we are an energy research and advisory firm providing data, analytical insight, and bespoke strategic advisory services across the energy value chain, which includes upstream oil and gas, as well as power and renewables. So as we've heard from Alessandro's presentation, investment in energy is expected to fall short of the level that's needed to meet ongoing demand growth. Now, ideally, this demand would be met with clean energy solutions, but even in the IEA's sustainable development scenario, we see continued need for oil and gas investment. And so the challenge then becomes how to meet this ongoing demand in the cleanest way possible. And from an oil and gas perspective, that means at the lowest emissions intensity possible. And so the challenge for governments is how to balance energy security needs with these environmental responsibility and considerations. Now, turning to the energy security side of the equation first, Denmark is in the relatively luxurious position of currently being able to meet most of its energy demand with domestically produced oil and gas, as well as wind and biomass. But the Danish continental shelf, as with most other sectors of the North Sea, is a mature hydrocarbon province. So Wood Mackenzie currently sees production from the North Sea peaking in 2020 before declining. We see gas declining at a faster pace than oil and reaching a minimum of about 45% of output in 2024. Now, this forecast does take into account fields that are already producing, as well as those under development, and also growth opportunities as we currently see them. And on that front, the good news is that project approvals did rebound in 2017 and 2018 following the downturn we saw after the oil price downturn in 2014. In particular, there were 54 FIDs across the North Sea since 2015. Of those, 34 were over 2017 and 2018. And these 54 project FIDs entail around 60 billion of CapEx. Now, as you can see, after some optimism at the start of the year, it looks like project FIDs are falling back again in 2019 from the levels that they have been at the last couple years. But we still see about another 19 project FIDs from now to 2022. Now, these new developments are expected to help slow the decline, but certainly not to reverse it. In particular, in Denmark, if we look at growth, the Tyra redevelopment is expected to make available further reserves through extending the life of the Tyra field and its satellites. We also see growth from new developments such as Snorre, Solsort, and Ada. And I'll take a moment to pause here and apologize for my very poor Danish pronunciation. So apologies if I'm murdering the names of your oil fields. But there's a lot that could change this picture. So again, this is how we currently see the forecast evolving, taking into account existing developments and future growth opportunities. But exploration in particular will be needed to continue the future supply of oil and gas, particularly as we head out into the latter part of the next decade. Now, when we look at exploration in terms of yet to find potential, we see that there is about the potential to double remaining reserves across the North Sea. So we see there being 71 billion BOE of remaining reserves across the UK, Norwegian, Dutch, and Danish sectors of the North Sea, with another 78 billion BOE of commercial yet to find potential. Of that, we see 960 million BOE of that yet to find potential in Denmark, which is about 50% more than the existing remaining potential of 1.6 billion BOE, at least according to Wood Mackenzie figures. Now, in terms of exploration rates, these have not rebounded in the same way as project FIDs did post the 2014 downturn. However, we see 115 wells planned, at least, over 2019 to 2021, which are targeting 5.5 billion BOE of prospective resource across all sectors of the North Sea. One of those, of course, is the Jill well, which is drilling here in Denmark. It's the first exploration well to be drilled here since 2015, and it's targeting 175 million BOE of resource. As we have heard today, and as everybody in the room I'm sure well knows, the future of exploration in Denmark is currently up for debate. And so in that context, I really want to focus the rest of this presentation around some of the innovative solutions that are helping to decrease the emissions intensity of offshore oil and gas developments and might help to ensure that oil and gas can remain part of the energy mix to meet ongoing demand requirements as we transition to a low-carbon future. Now, the good news is that new developments in oil and gas are about half as emissions intensive as existing developments. That's partly just due to the nature of an oil and gas field. As fields mature, they become more emissions intensive. That's partly because existing facilities are having to work equally hard in order to produce a smaller volume of hydrocarbons. In addition, as fields mature, secondary recovery techniques are often applied, and that further increases the intensity of these developments. So by contrast, newer developments have naturally stronger drives and are more productive, and so the emissions intensity is lower. However, we're also starting to see some really innovative solutions that directly help to reduce carbon emissions from oil and gas developments. Now, Norway is at the front of this innovation, if we look at your neighbor to the north. And it's due to a number of unique factors that we see at place in Norway. First of all, Norway has a supportive regulatory regime. So regulations in Norway require that oil and gas companies provide forecasts for emissions, as well as a cost-benefit analysis of mitigation options with every field development plan. Norway has also had a carbon tax in place since 1991, and the tax applicable to the offshore industry is today the highest in the world. Now, the exact price varies depending on foreign exchange rate movements, but it's currently about $50 per ton. This supportive regulatory regime, combined with the fact that Equinor, as a majority state-owned player, can act as an agent of the government to fulfill government policy objectives, has enabled a number of innovative approaches to carbon mitigation across the Norwegian sector of the North Sea. One of those is CCS, and that was first applied in 1996 at the Sleipner Vest field and has since been expanded to Snohvit and more recently Gudrun. Another one of Norway's unique attributes is that almost 100% of its electricity is supplied by zero-carbon hydropower. So that if you can connect offshore facilities to the onshore grid, you can significantly reduce the emissions intensity of operations. And this month, the Johan Sverdrup field became the first field to benefit from this solution as part of the Utsirahøy electrification project. Now, also this month, Equinor announced FID on the Hywind Tampen offshore project. And this will see the first integration of renewables with offshore oil and gas development. So let's look at these each in a bit more detail to understand the mitigation potential they have. If we start with CCS, the application of CCS currently helps to reduce Snohvit's upstream emissions in intensity by around 20%, and the overall field's emissions and intensity by around 10%. Now, it's important to mention how CCS is being employed at Snohvit. Snohvit gas has somewhere between 5% and 8% CO2 content. This gas needs to be removed from the stream before the gas is put into the liquefaction plant. And so the standard procedure in the oil and gas industry would be simply to vent that removed CO2 to the atmosphere. In Norway, at Snohvit, the partners are instead capturing it and storing it underground. But it's important to note that it's not post-combustion capture of CO2 that is taking place from either the upstream operations or from the liquefaction facility itself. And as you can see from the right-hand chart, the plant in particular is a rather emissions-intensive part of the process. But still, just handling the removed CO2 does help with the overall emissions profile of this asset. If we look at electrification, here we really see the potential to reduce the impact and intensity of oil and gas operations. So looking at the Johan Sverdrup field, this solution to electrify the field from shore has the potential to reduce the emissions and emissions intensity of the asset by somewhere between 90 and 98%. Again, this is largely due to the fact that Norway does have 100% of its power almost from hydropower, such that the only remaining emissions that are associated with the field are emissions related to ongoing drilling activities, non-routine flaring, and some inconsequential methane losses. Now, electrification has operational benefits as well as environmental benefits. If you consider that about 5% of a field's production is used to power facilities, electrification provides the opportunity to monetize that gas, or if not monetize it, perhaps use it for re-injection to improve oil recovery. And given that we have seen that there are a number of fields across the North Sea that have become gas deficient in their later lives, this is also an attractive option to avoid having to import gas from other fields or potentially shut down the field early. In addition to that, if you remove or at least reduce the need for in-field generation, that can help to reduce the space that you need on the facility, which lowers the overall environmental footprint and also brings health and safety benefits along with it. And finally, and perhaps the more important one to think about going forward, is in terms of costs. As renewables costs decrease, there is the potential for cost savings on that side as well. Now, again, in the example of Norway, the power is coming from hydropower, but most other countries are not in the same position as Norway in terms of having such a large hydropower resource. And so in order to have the same environmental benefits as hydropower in Norway, that power from shore would need to come from renewables such as solar or wind. Which right now in most countries on an unsubsidized basis are still more expensive than traditional power generation. But as these renewables continue to fall, we would expect there to be a cost benefit. And I guess the other thing to note, and what will become particularly important in the next example, is that, of course, not every field offshore is a candidate for electrification from shore, to the extent that they might be located too far offshore for that to be a feasible solution. And so then the real opportunity comes from integrating renewables with that development. And again, here also, if that power can be provided from renewables in a more cost-efficient manner, then there's a double benefit to be gained. So if we look at how integration with renewables might work, using the Hywind Tampen project as an example, here we can see that the project has the potential to potentially reduce emissions from the Snorre in Gullfaks fields by about 20 to 25%. So to give you a bit of background on the actual Hywind Tampen project, it involves the installation of 11 offshore turbines with 88 megawatts of combined capacity, which are expected to be able to provide about 35% of the power needs for Snorre and for Gullfaks over the course of their life. Now, because it's wind, it's obviously a variable resource, so at some points it will be able to generate a much higher percentage of the power needs and at other points lower, but on average it's expected to supply around 35% of those power needs. And you can see the emissions intensity that just that percentage, how that might impact the environmental footprint of that field. Now, there's 3 different ways that we see renewables being integrated with offshore oil and gas, and at least 2 of these solutions we do see as being applicable in Denmark. So first, there's power from onshore renewables, which involves constructing a subsea power cable to electrify the platform with power from shore. As discussed, in order for this to really have an environmental benefit, the power supply onshore really needs to be a clean power supply and cleaner than the power that would be produced by using in-field gas. Given that Norway has a huge concentration of wind power, we definitely see this criteria being fulfilled here. The fields are currently sort of at the reach of technology. For reference, the transmission distance for Johan Sverdrup is about 200 meters, but certainly that would seem feasible that the technology could be stretched in order to supply power for at least some of Denmark's fields. The second solution is to power facilities from existing offshore resources. And here, we maybe see this as being less applicable, mainly due to the fact that Denmark's existing offshore wind resources don't happen to be co-located with your oil and gas facilities. And when I'm talking about powering these from existing offshore resources, this means the physical supply of power. So we're not talking about, buying some power that is supplied from these and sort of using a financial transfer to do that. It's the physical supply of power to these facilities. The third, finally, is this integration with renewables similar to the Tampen Hywind project. And again, here we see really good potential, both due to sort of the large wind resources within Denmark, and the fact that, in fact, the water depths around the oil and gas fields here is relatively shallow in order to facilitate this development. Again, then it comes down to a question of policy and whether or not that would be supportive of this type of solution. Just as an example, to see what the potential could be in terms of lowering the emissions intensity of oil and gas produced in Denmark, I've sort of used a theoretical example of what the impact could be if offshore renewables were integrated with the redevelopment of Tyra. Now, obviously, the redevelopment is already underway, so it's probably a bit too late to make this decision. But just for argument's sake, if we assumed that offshore wind were deployed in the same way that it's being deployed in Norway, such that it could provide about 35% of the power requirements on Tyra, we see that being able to reduce the emissions intensity of the development by about 30%, or 30%, yes, sorry. On an ongoing basis. And so therefore help to lower the overall emissions footprint of this asset while continuing to supply oil and gas and meet ongoing energy security needs. So if we look back at the Norwegian experience, we see there being 3 factors that are really important in terms of fostering this innovation and helping to make the oil and gas sector more climate friendly. The first of these is a clean energy source. In Norway, it's hydropower, but here in Denmark, again, that's wind power. So we definitely see this being a criteria that can be fulfilled here. If we move all the way to the right, the second is the existence of a corporate champion. Again, in Norway, this is Equinor, but here that champion could be Ørsted, and it could leverage its expertise in delivering offshore wind, combined with its historical expertise in oil and gas, in order to provide a similar solution for Denmark. And then the third component is the supportive regulatory environment. And I guess that is the piece that's really up for debate in terms of how the government is going to continue to view the role of oil and gas in Denmark's energy mix and what policies it might make available to facilitate ongoing development and production. With that, I will conclude. Thank you.